Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick Gumowitz, the Angelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan, Ganz, Cooney, and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Minard and Norton Garfinkle, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. Our guest today is the most prolific novelist or writer of any creed on the planet. In our libraries and on our e-readers, you'll find the seemingly endless volumes of James Patterson's books, psychological thrillers that have gripped the American public and become a staple of our cultural diet. As Todd Purdom profiled in the Vanity Fair story, How James Patterson Became the Ultimate Storyteller, the best-selling author is our Henry Ford of the contemporary book world. Beneath his creative pulse, however, is an entrepreneurial genius, honed over a 3-decade-long tenure as an ad executive for the J. Walter Thompson Company. Alongside his stable of collaborators, Patterson confines himself to a rigorous regimen of writing and editing, marinating in ideas for his next blockbuster novel. Over 300 million sold and counting, a dream author for an industry hampered by the digital revolution. Through fatherhood, the act of instilling the value of books in his son, Patterson discovered a newfound passion for youth literacy, the topic of our conversation today. He founded the organization Read Kiddo Read, authored a slew of children's volumes and companion lesson plans, and undertook philanthropy to support student scholarships. Despite being the last standing titan of commercial publishing, Patterson has invested in independent bookstores. And today, after welcoming him, thank you for being here.
You're welcome. I was in advertising, but I've been clean for almost 20 years now, so, you know.
Independent bookstores to preserve the unfettered written word, as I said in a program with the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop. Is that why you're after investing in...
The thing with independent bookstores, for me, one, we help a couple hundred bookstores. And that's terrific because what happens in those stores is it's just, something physically happens. In some cases, a store could buy a van or a used van. It would make it easier for them to bring books to schools, things like that. But it's so motivating to them, the idea that somebody cares. So that's one piece of it. Secondly, in those stores, it allows them to get local publicity, which they can almost never get because it gets picked up. But the most important thing to me is to shine a light on the problem because a lot of newspapers, we're talking about it now, just shining a light on the problem that if we don't have independent bookstores or bookstores in general, Barnes & Noble, books in Walmart, et cetera, it's going to be a problem. If we don't have competent readers in this country, if kids aren't reading, there will be no PBS in the future, in my opinion, because there will be nobody to support it.
In other words, books should never be obsolete. The physical
written
material.
I don't care whether the physical book may become obsolete. I don't know, and I don't really care.
But paper and pen, do they facilitate, foster, breed a culture of literacy that ebooks will never accomplish?
I don't know. The only thing, recently there have been some studies that people retain information better when they read it in a book versus an ebook. I suspect that may partly have to do just with the newness of the machine, and it may just be a little more distracting to people initially. Over time, I have a feeling that will go away. I don't care ultimately whether, in some future decade, it's all done online. But right now, we're not ready for that transition. We need bookstores. We desperately need bookstores. We need libraries. We need school libraries. all over the country you have school libraries that are underfunded, either don't have enough books or don't have any books in some cases, and don't have a librarian.
In other words, the educational vehicle that books present us, they have to keep pace with the technology.
Funding in schools is always going to be a problem. Unfortunately, local governments and the government at large, we're not taking seriously, education, and yet we wind up spending a fair amount of money per student. Well, we don't seem to be spending it very wisely. The next thing that I'm going to do next year, we'll continue to support independent bookstores, but I'm going to make a big move toward supporting school libraries. So that's going to be the next thing.
Todd Purdom wrote in Vanity Fair, "Writer's block never presents a problem for you. If you get bored or stymied with a project, you turn your attention to dozens of other ideas."
If you come to my office, what you will see is 2 desks, but surrounded by shelves. And on the shelves, there will be anywhere from 40 to 55 manuscripts that are all alive. They're all happening at this moment. And people are funny about co-writing and the notion of it. I mean, you start. Who are co-writers? Well, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Simon and Garfunkel, Lennon and McCartney. It's absolutely, collaborating is a good thing. The internet is all about collaborating. If there wasn't collaboration, there wouldn't be an internet. So that's not a bad thing per se. The way it works with me, this past year, in addition to 2 books that I wrote by myself, I wrote over 1,000 pages of outlines. And all of my outlines are 3 or 4 drafts, because that's the heart of the story. And the outlines are 60 to 90 pages. So that's misunderstood a little bit, just in terms of what it is. And recently, we have a TV show which is being shot starting in January. And I went out to Hollywood, and I went to the writer's room. And these are guys that are men and women who write 40-page, 44-page scripts. There were 10 writers in the writer's room. Collaboration, once again. And out there, any TV show you like, whether it's Homeland or The Good Wife, chances are it's all collaboration in terms of the screenplays, the teleplays.
I mentioned this quote because to stick with the subject of youth literacy for a moment, it seems like we have a reader's block. There is an obstacle in front of us in terms of our inability to embrace a new generation of readers. How do we get to this problem? Through curricula, through lesson plans, through your books, especially the children's books and young adult readers that you're targeting now? Because it seems to be a cultural shift as we move away from the written word in a physical presence, that we're having a more difficult time attracting readers and maturing readers.
Well, I think one of the things, especially I think middle school is vital. That's why I write a lot of books toward middle school kids. There's 2 sides. One, real bright kids, if they don't, you want them to have broad reading tastes. So that's the important thing in terms of bright kids, to make sure that they read a lot, so that they're. Right now we have a society where it's so like right, left, black and white. Well, things aren't black and white. Things aren't right and left. They're and the more you read, the more you understand that. And I think the wiser you become. I think the better citizen you become. I think the better spouse you become. I think the better parent you become. If you've and I think reading certainly is one way to that. So for kids that are already
engagement.
Absolutely, and for kids who are good readers already, it's important that they're reading broadly. Just as important, or maybe more important, are kids who, if they don't become competent readers in middle school, not great readers, but competent readers, how are they going to get through high school? Seriously, Abraham Lincoln, and it's not that they're stupid; it's just they're not good readers. And look, there are a lot of problems in the world. Healthcare, global warming. As individuals, we can't do much about it, but almost all of us can do something about the reading problem. Start with your house. Are your kids or your grandkids or your nieces and nephews, are they competent readers or good readers? Are you making sure that they go to the library, encouraging them to read? Are you, every holiday or birthday, are you considering a book being one of the gifts? Why not? How crazy that is. Look, most parents wouldn't send their kids out with a handicap out into the world if they could do something about it. Well, if you send your kids out into the world and they're not competent readers, you're sending them out there with a handicap. And that's your job. That's your job. Teach your kid how to ride a bike, fine, not a bad thing to do. Teach them how to throw a baseball, okay. Teach them how to cook a little bit, terrific. You must teach them how. You must help them. You must get them books. You must force the issue if you have to. When our son Jack's a bright guy. When he was he wasn't a big reader. And that summer, and summer is a great time to do this stuff, and we said, Jack, you're going to read every day. And his response was, do I have to? And we said, yeah, unless you want to live out in the garage. We read in our house. But we're going to go out and get cool books for you. And we get everything from Percy Jackson to A Wrinkle in Time to My Maximum Ride. And by the end of the summer, he had read a dozen books. And his reading skills improved dramatically. When he took his SSATs, which you do he got an 800 in reading, which is a perfect score. So there's what happens when you get a bright kid and you force the issue a little bit in a fun way. The fun way being, yes, you're going to read, but we're going to get you cool books. And they're going to be as good or better than the movies that you might see or the TV shows or whatever. And with kids that aren't competent, it's absolutely crucial. And parents have come up to me all the time, I can't get my kids reading. And I'm like, well, do you get them to the dinner table? Yeah. Well, you just have to make it a thing in your house. I mean, do you have rules in the house like you can't tramp mud on the living room rug? Yeah. Okay, you have to have a rule. The kids have to read, because if they're not reading, they're just going to have trouble in life.
Are we too distractible? Do you encounter that in your mission to...
What? Distractible? What? Yeah, but I mean, it's a fact of life now. It's a fact of, yes, I think people are easily distracted. I mean, obviously, you have TV commercials saying it's wrong to do one thing at a time. What? Kids should be doing no, kids should not be doing two things at a time. No, you should not be texting and driving and drinking a coffee. You should be driving, maybe sipping a coffee, maybe. Yeah, we're very distractible, but we just have to live with that now. I mean, that's just a fact of life. So how do you deal with that, in a pragmatic manner, given that that's just the way it is now?
How do you? Cool books.
Yeah.
Devices that...
Yeah, no, because you'll find, yes, once you hook somebody into a story, they're hooked, and they're not distractible. I think one of the issues, and this has gone on forever, I mean, it was true when I was in school, is not enough stories and books that the kids really get into and love. I mean, for Jack, when he was 11 or so, Unbroken was a book, and he just went, this is great. I mean, it was a 400 or 500 page book, but he really got hooked on it. Harry Potter, obviously. J.K. Rowling saved a lot of lives, because if you've read the 8 books, you're a competent reader. That's terrific. What a wonderful thing she did by creating that story, that big story. I mean, when I was a kid, Lord of the Rings was something that a lot of us read. Those kinds of series or whatever. But that solves to some extent, the distraction problem.
It seems to me that our schools may be too rigid in enforcing an idea of what literature should be.
Yeah, I mean, you have the problem now of the Common Core. Where does it go too far? Yeah, I think one of the things now is I wish we'd just stop totally reinventing the wheel every 4 years. Okay, fine, we have this Common Core thing now. How do we evolve it? What are the problems with it? Obviously, one of the problems is some schools aren't ready as fast as other schools. So how do you deal with that? You just can't say, well, all of them, 2 years from now, we're lowering the boom and we're going to flunk half the, you can't do that, in my opinion. And we can't we can't demotivate teachers. Teachers have to be motivated to feel that they're contributing. And I think at least initially, the power of stories is not valued as much as it should be. I think even in some of the better prep schools and colleges now, kids don't read as widely. They're more into we're going to spend 2 months analyzing one Shakespeare play. And there's some value in that. You're learning, critical thinking and really getting deep into things. But there's also value in the notion of, in a college or in a prep school, that anybody who goes there, they're going to be exposed to 200 or 300 voices, writers, different ways of looking at the world. Here's the way J.K. Rowling, here's the way Doris Lessing, here's the way Stephen King, here's the way, they're all different ways of looking at the world and different ways of expressing themselves. And I think it's really important that students get, especially students at universities or good schools, that they are exposed and begin to understand the value of different ways of looking at the world.
I've heard from a mutual friend that you're a master scribbler and that you observe the surroundings and have, even before you began in earnest, your...
I actually wrote a novel about this show before we did it.
I believe it. So from your scribbling, the senses around you, from what do you find the most inspiration in constructing your characters and storylines?
There's so much that stimulates me. I have at home a file about this thick, and cleverly entitled Ideas. And it's just page after page after page of ideas. I'm constantly, I'll be driving here and I'll have another, and I'll just scribble down an idea for a book or half a book or something, or a character or something that might turn into something. And that's why I really got into doing, more than one book. It's just that I had so many ideas that I thought were really cool and interesting and needed to be written, and I couldn't do all of them by myself.
But what is the creative process in your mind? And because people are riveted when they read you. There's an element of suspense. There's an element of kind of multiple layers of.
Well, I think it's the three laws of real estate. Location, location, location. I think for me, the rules of writing the kind of books that I write is story, story, story. And when I'm writing a story, I like to think there's one person sitting across from me, and I don't want them to get up until I'm finished the story. So I want to keep it moving along. Michael Connelly, who's a very good mystery writer, said what Jim does is every scene, literally every single scene, is created to move both the characterization and the action forward, and to turn on the movie projector in our heads. And I think that's very accurate, and I think he said it better than I
could. These gifts to local libraries, to return to the subject of literacy, you mentioned before that you're focusing on those in need in local communities and kind of enriching the cultural milieu of these communities. Where are we most in dire need of that?
Everywhere.
Is it
everywhere? Really, yeah. It's
a universal truth?
No, it's not a universal thing, but there are pockets in obviously in the big cities. There are always, there are parts of the big cities, whether it's New York or Los Angeles, Chicago, that are just not doing well. About 6 weeks ago, I did a talk for all of the middle school principals in New York City, which was great. And interestingly, what the Board of Education wanted me to talk about was encouraging the principals to get their students to read for fun. That was what they wanted them to do, because they know, they're smart enough to know that that's how you hook kids. Look, if they taught movies in school, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. You could deal with characterization and storylines and arcs and all sorts of interesting things. But if we started with Ingmar Bergman films, we'd all go, I don't really like movies. So there need to be more stories that kids can relate to them and go, this is really interesting. That moved me. As opposed to, well, we must read The Red Badge of Courage. No, we don't have to read it. It's okay. Or we must read Great Expectations. We don't have to read Great Expectations. And we certainly don't have to memorize the names of the characters and, do those sort of, who cares? Doesn't matter. And some kids, they memorize automatically, and that's one of the problems with how kids do or don't get into the better colleges. A lot of kids who retain information, that's looked at as intelligence, and it isn't necessarily intelligence. They retain information.
And that standardization of curricula is troubling to you. That's standardized, that we so insistently enforce A Raisin in the Sun, The Great Gatsby. There's not, to use the name of this program, an open-mindedness towards.
Yeah, open mind. Yeah, I mean, obviously, a brilliant name for the show, and much needed. And it's this show and the title. It's the opposite of what's all over television. It's the closed mind and the closed mind and the open mind. I mean, yeah, we do need to be more open to how we and obviously on a local level. I said this before, but teachers need to have some leeway in terms of what they teach and how they teach, and they can't spend the whole year preparing for a test, because if that's not the way to get kids involved, in my opinion.
Maybe you're so flexible because you craft so many disparate storylines and weave them together both in single volumes and sequels, that there can be an idea of an allegory, say. There's Plato's cave, obviously, and there the doctor's eyes in Gatsby. But fundamentally, you can create truths in multiple allegories. Should we not be so restrictive in terms of what I'm thinking about my...
Well, look, you can't... At this stage, nobody can read everything, so nobody will have covered everything anyway. So let's give tastes. Let's give a taste of Shakespeare, and let's give a taste of John Cheever, and let's give a taste of J.K. Taste, and then eventually, we'll go out and follow up on some of those things as we get older.
I would ask what's next, but you have the volumes of books here
for us. Well, one of the things that's next are a lot of kids' books. More kids' books than ever. I'm really going to get a lot more serious. The publisher just dug up a thing which a lot of people aren't aware of, but I have more #1 best-selling children's books than any living author, which I think people aren't aware of. And that comes out of a passion. It's just totally a passion to write books where kids are going to read the book and go, give me another book. It's that simple. That was I really enjoyed that. And there's always something going on in the books that I write. iFunny, that series, it's about a kid who decides he wants to be a stand-up comedian. What do you have to do when you decide you want to do something? You need to study. So he studies every comedian in the history of mankind. He studies every joke, and then he starts writing his own jokes. Well, that's how you approach anything. Whatever you want to, you must study. So that's a good thing for kids to be learning and thinking about. Now, the complication here is this boy can never be a stand-up comedian because he's in a wheelchair. Now, and what is the role of humor in dealing with tough breaks in life? And where's that all going to go? And he's in the world's funniest kid contest, and can he do well in that, or is it going to be a limitation, the fact that he's in a wheelchair? And so there's a story to grab onto. There's a lesson to be learned. So everything I write for kids, it's of that sort. There's something to think about. There's something to talk about. There's something to talk about in the classrooms.
I think your focus on middle school, and we were saying here in the studio, is spot on, because it's a phase of life when, if you don't have that book to gravitate towards, that idea, that passion is not born then. It may never be born.
And part of it is the kids, most of the kids are old enough to actually focus and concentrate at that point. A lot of kids when they're younger, they really can't, they're not ready to focus yet. That's why, but a lot of schools can't afford it. But these schools that will do these contests where you're going to read 40, 50, 60, whoever gets the most gets the pizza party. A lot of schools can't afford to do that, unfortunately. But that's very valuable because those kids, they just get competent. It's like anything. I went to schools, who likes soccer? Yay! Are you better now or 4 years ago? We're better now. Why? We play a lot. Exactly. It's the same with reading. You need to practice it. But the great thing about reading is, look, you want to be Chuck Berry, you want to be a great guitar player. It's painful for a while. You want to be a great reader, it can be interesting right from the get-go. The first book, you'll be a little slow going through it, but it can be a pretty cool story. So you can be stimulated right from the beginning in terms of reading.
I was so interested in what you said, and we're wrapping up now, but about speaking to middle school principals. It does seem that with the implementation of the Common Core curriculum, vocabulary has become more advanced at an earlier stage, and therefore middle school students may be more equipped to handle not necessarily your adult volumes, but more advanced reading responsibilities and opportunities. Is that in accordance with what you've seen?
Yeah, no, kids are, well, it depends. Once again, it's school to school to school.
But in New York, in particular,
in New York, it's school to school. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's admirable. It's so fascinating to hear you comment on books and learning and the future of both. And thank you for being on the program today, James Patterson.
Thank you for having an open mind.
Thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other Open Mind interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick Gumowitz, the Angelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan, Ganz, Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Minard and Norton Garfinkle, with special thanks to the Schumann Media Center for additional support, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.